I knew that the first two speakers would be moderates. Our last speaker is Marvin Minsky, Donner Professor of Science here at MIT, who also holds the prestigious Turing Award in Computer Science. Professor Minsky was educated at Princeton and Harvard. He apprenticed by such teachers as Miller, von Neumann, and McCullough, and argued with B.F. Skinner and S.S. Stevens. Together with Newell, Simon at Carnegie, and McCarthy, then at MIT, later at Stanford, they established the field of artificial intelligence, which in its early days was the subject of considerable skepticism, but is now widely accepted by industry and by academic institutions. Professor Minsky headed for many years the well-known MIT Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, which he founded. Professor Minsky, besides being a thinker, is also a builder and doer of things. His well-known theories on learning and intelligence are punctuated by such things as the design and construction of an electron microscope in his early years, or a digital computer a couple of years ago, or an electronic organ. Now, by now you must think that the speakers are trying to outdo each other in the choice of cute titles. Professor Minsky is above such tricks. When I asked him, since he was to follow the first two speakers, to give us an optimistic view of the future partnership of people and computers, he gave me the following title: A Future So Bright You Will Need Sunglasses.
They're not moderate, they're downright reactionary. That last question about what the poor people will do, and the answer, I think, is right. Only the very rich will be able to do without consoles, because perhaps because they can hire some poor person to watch for the message that someone's looking at your files. It reminds me, many years ago, I sent my home console back to MIT, not because I was tired of it, but because I wanted to be the first person to send his home console back. Thanks to Corby here, who created the system that it ran on. I don't know if I was actually the first to send it back, but I have a problem in talking about the things I'd like to talk about, because I'm at the, I feel there's the pressure of seeing who can be the most humanistic and who can talk most about social responsibility, and who is going to be the most moderate, or rather, who is going to be the most effective in suppressing the inventions that the technologists come across. And I have an injunction to Paul Gray, which is that it's all very well to be humanistic and to understand the fine art of legal and bureaucratic suppressions of inventions, but let's not go overboard on this. Maybe we should have some way of letting people invent something before we suppress it. And I don't know what Professor Bell meant by all that about the golem, but I think he was giving a 1950s-style speech. Well, actually, you see, in 1950, we knew that computers could crunch numbers, but the idea that they could shovel information around was considered fantastic, right? Nobody thought that it would do. Now, I think we're at the end of the information processing era, not the beginning. Let's not have any mistake about this. The computers are still limping along. If you ask a computer library system for an article that's about the transformation of some nucleic acid by some enzyme. What it will give you today is all of the articles that happen to have the words enzyme, or name of that enzyme or something. In other words, they're information processing the way a steam shovel processes gravel. We know how to do better than that. And this era of processing documents and data without knowing what they mean, which is what all the systems our friends were talking about, these data banks, is different from the idea of a machine that looks at the data bank, and you don't need some evil politician or insurance man. Maybe the computer itself says, aha, this guy is vulnerable to such and such. I can get his money by some sort of blackmail. And there are all sorts of bad things that could happen that you're not even dreaming of. And what I want to do is to make it possible so that we can prevent them. Now, please don't laugh so much. All right, now why are people conservative? There are various reasons. First, they might be right, and the people predicting these strange things could be wrong. Well, let's rule that one out. Then we must look for psychological reasons why people are cautious and careful. One is that they think these things might happen, but they don't want to have any part of it because the responsibility is too great. And I've certainly ruled that out for these gentlemen. They like responsibility. And third, I think there's a sort of Freudian problem here. And in order to explain it to you, or at least the way I see it, I have to make up a fantasy or parable. Let's imagine that there was a person or other, you can, sometime in the middle 1950s in a think tank somewhere. At that time, there became social awareness of systems problems, and we started to set up in this society a new kind of academy, which wasn't the university. It was called a think tank, and there was some feeling that there needed to be some place in society where you could do that. Well, you know, things like the airplane interception problem and stuff like that. And in this same era, then, people started to think about future, and some people said, Herman Kahn's an example, Al Toffler. There are people who have made a reputation as futurists. And let me tell you what their problem is. It's a funny problem, and I'm not picking on any particular one of them, but suppose that you were standing around in the middle 1950s and you said, well, I'm going to have to tell people what's going to happen in the future so they can be prepared for it, but I want to establish myself as a prophet, and so there are two kinds of things you have to do to predict the future. First, you have to predict the major technological revolutions. But that's not all when you're dealing with history, because we don't know how they'll affect things. So we also have to be good sociologists. We have to understand, I forget what Dr. Bell's 4 principles of how cultures organize themselves are, but in any case, you have to make up some such thing and defend it and debug it. Let's take the first part, though. How do you guess what the major technological evolutions are going to be? And I think the problem that faced the Herman Kahns and the Alvin Tofflers and people like that was that they weren't there first, strangely enough, because let's look at the things that seem to be happening. This genetic manipulation over the horizon. Who thought about that and predicted that it might have a large effect on the world? Aldous Huxley, in his pioneering science fiction book, Brave New World. Who thought we might have robots and artificial intelligences? Isaac Asimov in his robotic series, Robert Heinlein in his more recent things. Who thought we might have remote manipulations and machines that do things in other places? That's Heinlein. Who thought that one of the major parts of man's future would be going into the universe and going to the moon and into space and occupying new planets and having a huge civilization? Asimov again and others. So who's done the thinking? Now, you can laugh and you say, well, those are just writers. those are just science fiction writers. Well, I think they're very smart people. I've spent a lot of my time with them and find that they think about social interactions. Someone like Asimov is not exactly a sociologist, but it'd be hard to find one who makes judgments as good. And so I mentioned 3 things, or 4, I forget. There's the intelligent computer, the possibility of artificial intelligence, there's the possibility of genetic manipulation, there's the possibility of space travel. And in the robots, there's also the automatic factory, the laborless society where nobody works, and I think that's going to come. And I don't know how Dr. Bell is going to deal. Well, I guess you mentioned that they'll all be bureaucrats, and they won't actually have to do anything. But what's the point of my parable? The point of it is that then if somebody wants to come here and tell you about a new idea, a new problem, what does he have to do? He can't take that stuff because that's science fiction. And I'm serious about this. This is a real intellectual problem of our time. You can't take artificial intelligence seriously because it's Buck Rogers stuff. You read about it in the pulps rather than the journals. The whole thing seems too fantastic. And so all of our people planning our society so carefully and worrying about problems that are about to come are trying to find what's the 4th most likely thing. So I want to talk about the most likely thing, even though almost everyone says, well, of course, computers will only process data. They won't think. They won't be intelligent. They won't compete with man. They won't do anything very important except process your grocery bill. Well, that is not moderate or middle of the road if it's processing your credit rating. That's just off on the bicycle path or something. So what is going to happen? Why don't we talk about that a little bit? Take the robot. It doesn't exist right now. There are a few places working on things. There's something called an industrial robot, and I think the word is about to change its name. The word originally was invented by Karol Čapek in his play R.U.R., and it stood for genetically produced artificial humans, who in fact were human. And you read between the lines of the play, and of course they're more human than the bureaucrats who are employing them in their factory. So the original idea of robot came from the Czech word for worker, and now when we talk about robots, I think we have a sort of complicated image from the mixture of elements of science fiction that come to us from the movies and television. And in industry, robot right now has a very silly meaning. It stands for a mechanical arm that is programmed to make pre-programmed motions, and the research laboratories are slowly starting to develop ways to make them more versatile. Can I have some water, Mike?
You may be out of water, but
Oh, well. I was just going to talk about the moon, where there isn't any. What's beginning to happen now, and could happen rather rapidly, and probably will happen in Japan before here, unless we make a deal with them or something, is that we'll start to have factory workers which do simple things reasonably well. People at Stanford Research Institute have debugged a gadget which is a mechanical arm for picking up and moving things, but it's not quite pre-programmed. It has enough vision to maybe I drank too much water.
we had a telepresence here.
Yeah, so we're starting to get things in automatic factories that do very boring things. At the other end of the spectrum, we have projects like one at MIT where we're designing programs to design computers to do things. In other words, we're trying to get the labor out of designing a program. A few years ago, if I wanted an integrated circuit chip for something, it might cost $1 million and take a couple of years to design. The same thing we can have a student do now in a few weeks. And the reason is that he only gives it general instructions. The computer knows all of the dirty work of laying out these hundreds or thousands of little parts in various arrays, either regular or stored in the computer's memory. And Professor Sussman here is working on schemes where, in the end, you won't even tell it how to make the computer. You will tell it what that little computer should do, and as a set of constraints, and it'll figure out some computer circuit that does that. So we're starting to get some intelligence in these little machines. If you wander around the world today and look in artificial intelligence laboratories, you will notice the most peculiar thing. It's backwards evolution of a sort. You see computers playing very good chess. You see a computer beating the world champion at backgammon, which I'm told is a very difficult thing to do. I guess by definition, he's the best one. It was a sort of sad little episode, in fact, because he had only been world champion for a week, and the game was, for money. So the designer of the program had to apologize to him and say the computer had been somewhat luckier at dice than the human, but that's the breaks. If you look around the world, I was going to say, you'll find these computers being very good at things that people admire, and you'll find them very bad at things that people don't admire. We worked for some long time to understand how to get a computer to understand space and geometry well enough to build little structures with toy blocks, and finally got some demonstrations where you could throw some blocks on the table and the computer would see them. That was very hard to do, and computer vision still is very bad, but one can see a few things, and we're hoping to embark on a project where you can get a computer to understand and see more things. Seeing is not like television or photography. You actually have to have some sort of theory of what you're seeing in order to see it, because you're going from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions in a way that requires you're pumping some information into the situation. It's not really all there. We have no program that can tell a dog from a cat, but just about every 3-year-old can do that. And so artificial intelligence is very uneven. We're very good at certain kinds of expertise that people find incredibly difficult, and we don't know how to do a number of things that people find very simple. But I assure you that there are lots of theories around among the people in this field, and that are quite interesting and scientific and sophisticated, and I think in a certain time, everybody always wants one to say how many years X will take. You can have 2 views of it. One view that people have is that there's something missing in all of this. There's the spark of intuition. The artificial intelligence people can never succeed because the mind is not a machine. There is something missing in this, some intuitive element. Another theory is that, which is mine, which is that we have a lot of principles to fool around with now, because the 20 years of computer science has, I think, increased the number of ideas in psychological theories tenfold or something. And in fact, we don't need a great invention to explain creativity or intuition. What we need is an administrative invention for how to put the fragments of procedures and ideas together. If you make a big complicated machine, it won't work because there's some administrative thing wrong. Maybe this part gets in a loop, or this one is dominating that one, and so forth. And I think the secret of making a clever mind is making a sort of corporation in there, where there are some people in your head who notice that the others are wasting time and just tell them to stop. Anyway, there is a myth that people have something called creativity. People are always saying, well, you know, I was working on a problem for a long time and I didn't get anywhere, and then suddenly I got the answer. And it's just such a mysterious phenomenon that people should consider this suddenly to be meaningful. Because it's like saying, I was building this house out of bricks, and I put all these bricks up, and finally I put in the last brick, and suddenly this house appeared. The naivete of the smartest person's introspection into what might be happening in his own mind is, the smarter they are, the more childish I find when it comes to discussing the experience of thinking, or what it is like to be, or that sort of thing. So anyway, what are these big things that are going to happen that MIT will be left out of unless its administration gets rid of the shame of being associated with things that are in science fiction. I don't mean to point a finger at anyone, but I feel that somehow it's not popular to talk about the machines really being intelligent. It's not popular to talk about really having colonies on the moon and things like that, not because they're technologically difficult, which they are, but because they're too good. I think in just 10 years, we could put a man on the moon, for example. I was at a meeting, though, of the top NASA administration a little while ago where I fooled them into responding to that statement by saying, absolutely not, it's unthinkable. It really happened. Jerry Pournelle is writing it up in a story somewhere, but we were there. But seriously, I think in 20 years we could land on the moon for a pretty low cost, a permanent colony of, say, 20 people. What do these people do? They live in a habitat that's hard-landed with them. They're not coming back unless there's an emergency. We also land 100 tons of what are called teleoperators, telepresence devices. These are big machines that you put your hands in on Earth, and you feel what's happening to the one on the moon. Now, of course, there's a 2.5-second delay, so it's not that simple. But with some computer assistance, and if you're dealing with large things like the parts of a giant lunar factory, that time delay isn't so bad. And what could happen is that these 20 people on the moon could supervise the construction work of perhaps 1,000 people on the Earth who come in and work their little work days as though they were on the moon and build all this big stuff. After a while, at rather low expense, the expense is limited by the fact that there's a very sharp curve in sending additional supplies. So this project has to be designed to use lunar materials, and various serious people have actually made studies to show how it's easy to get 95% of everything from the moon and harder to get 99, so on. What I'm saying is that if we had courage, in just 20 years or so, we could have a large factory on the moon that's shipping stuff back to Earth at sort of enormous cost with respect to the investment, but very cheap incrementally. And then around that time, we would be making machines that are automatic enough to make copies of the factory. This is Bob Frosch's idea. In fact, he's head of NASA, and some committees have been discussing this idea, and there's nothing wrong with it except that everyone snickers. We really could, with what we know now, I think, build self-reproducing factories in space that would produce things like O'Neill colonies. It's not a very long time. It could solve Earth's energy problems in perhaps a neater way than any other. These things could build the notorious solar power satellite, which appears marginally economical right now, but again, I think people snicker and worry because it's a Buck Rogers thing. I don't think the nation is taking the solar power satellite seriously enough. It's certainly not taking artificial intelligence seriously enough. Fortunately, and we don't have any Russians to compete with. There isn't much of an AI gap in that direction because I think because the mathematicians there were too good and got the people to be too rigorous. And so also the mathematicians are in power, and they don't like AI much because it's heuristic and they like proofs. So in Russia, the field hasn't developed so well. In England, it was developing nicely, except that in fact, a mathematician, Lighthill, with his power, managed to heap enough ridicule on it to pretty well demolish it. In Japan, it's in very high repute, and that, of course, is our main threat from Japan, not the cars themselves, but the machines that are going to make them without any labor cost. I can't think of anything to summarize this with, except that I think Rabin said that somehow computer science had matured. And so now we can make sober judgments about what's important. And I think that's just plain wrong. It's still very rapidly developing. And if you ask computer experts what they think is is the sort of final state of things, like automatic programming. I don't think there will be a huge market for programmers in 20 years if we have our way. It's going to suddenly go down because the automatic programming things will be so much better and economical than a person that suddenly that entire industry with millions or hundreds of thousands of people in it is going to burst like a bubble. And that's going to come, but you won't be prepared for it unless you believe that the machines can have some sense. Yeah.
There are going to be some questions. You want to sit up?
Sure.
Time for question. Yes, Professor Bell.
I'm a little puzzled at this mixture of arrogance and defensiveness which characterized Professor Minsky's presentation. It's sort of 50.
Characterizes me, not my president.
I don't know the exact proportions. It's like 50-50, the old Polish story, one horse, one chicken is making a meal. I don't know what the proportions come down to. But one a factual point, the other a perhaps more debatable point. This thing about science fiction seems to me is itself a fiction because in almost all cases, if you go back and see where these people got their ideas from, it came from a very different source. In the 1920s, for example, there was a series called Today and Tomorrow, about 50 little books. One of them was a book by J.B.S. Haldane, which dealt with genetics. And Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is literally a paraphrase of J.B.S. Haldane. And one could finally take every one of these elements. So one needn't go, it seems to me, to these aspects of being bravura in these ways, and one can make an argument in a much more sustained way without necessarily going that far out. In fact, in a different context, I brought along a thought which is an interesting one as to where some of the ideas come from. And it's a statement which says, there's only one condition on which we can imagine managers not needing subordinates and masters not needing slaves. This condition would be that each inanimate instrument could do its own work at the word of command or by intelligent anticipation, like the statues of Daedalus or the tripods made by Hephaestus, of which Homer relates that of their own motions they entered the conclave of the gods on Olympus, as if a shuttle should weave of itself and a plectrum should do its own harp playing. This is the first paragraphs, if you will, of Aristotle's Politics.
I think that's not my point. My point wasn't who first thought of it, but it's where the people here first heard it, because I wasn't concerned with the invention of the idea, but why you're ashamed of it. Why are you ashamed of space travel? Because it's pulp. It doesn't matter if Aristotle thought of it and I didn't read
exactly.
it. I'm not worried about credit.
The problem is let's not then set up sham items. Not only shame items, but sham items. You put it all as a matter of courage in this respect.
I did.
If that were only the case, it seems to me there'd be no problem.
I put it as shame, not courage.
Well, shame in some respects is also a matter of courage, because some people don't have the courage and feel ashamed, if you will. What I tried to indicate, perhaps too briefly, and what I think was implicit in what Professor Rabin is indicating, is the question of the scale of choices. You seem to indicate there's only one choice, which is your way. There's only one choice, which is your courage. Only one choice, which is your imagination, which may be fine. But then you want people to finance it. Now, the only way that can be financed is to rate it against other kinds of choices and other kinds of notions in this respect. And if you can make the kind of argument you make, and I respect the kinds of imagination you put forward, I respect the possibilities it opens up, I respect the fact we may be able to mine the moon, but it can only be done not on the basis of courage or shame, but by saying what other things do we have to do as well? What are our priorities? And if you want to make an argument on this respect, then one has to lay out a set of social goals and, in effect, try to argue through the compatibility of values. It seems to me if one wants to deal then with the potentialities of technology, it can only be done in those terms, not simply saying we don't need to have the courage or we have the shame.
No, I think you misunderstood. What I was saying is that... Yeah.
I was going to say, in anticipation of a long debate, which could get even longer, I thought I might turn the floor to Professor Rabin, who wants to ask a question.
Well, I must say that I felt singularly unafraid. The only thing which worried me a little bit when the name of Freud was mentioned here, I was looking around for a couch, but once there was none, I stayed in my seat. Now, on a more serious level, I'm not really in disagreement with you, but I would like to see the things in another kind of perspective. You see, you were mentioning together in the same breath certain things, like, for example, space travel and genetic engineering, and you were claiming, in a way, success by association.
I wasn't concerned with success.
Let's see. Let me state the question. In other words, space travel looked extremely impossible and unlikely, and it was achieved. I don't think there is anybody here who is afraid of that. It's certainly not I. Genetic engineering and the breaking of the genetic code looked very unlikely to begin with, has been achieved. Now you mention artificial intelligence in the same sentence. There is no way of saying about a problem which hasn't yet been solved, how far or how close are we to the solution of that problem before it has been solved. And the common wisdom has it, you see, when people ask, well, when is it going to happen? Common wisdom usually has it that it is going to happen like cancer cure, another extremely more pressing problem, in about 10 years. And this answer is being given, or 15, is being given in 1960 and in 1970, and we don't have a better answer in 1980.
Well, sure we do. I mean, there isn't a single moment at which it happens. It's like the house.
Well, there are, those who are really in the know, and who realize the difference between a chess player and between a program that can do, say, extracting information from a text by semantics, by understanding. There is a great difference between the two. We haven't yet, these are things of different orders. We have pretty well solved one, we haven't solved the other. The fact that we have solved one doesn't have a clear implication on how and when we'll solve the other. That's my opinion.
What I'm saying is that we have already solved enough problems that with some effort, we could probably replace most industrial jobs very quickly. Now, and I feel that the nation in general isn't facing that because it's embarrassed about it.
Could I make one more comment? We have also eradicated and cured many diseases. We really did mankind, a fantastic job on it. Now, this does not have a clear implication on how and when we'll solve the problem of cancer.
I would like to give an opportunity to the audience to ask some questions. Yes, sir.
One of the key issues that the first two speakers addressed was the abuse of power by computer systems. You suggested that artificial intelligence will open up new vistas in the use of computers, that information processing as we know it now is very crude. Could you comment on whether the artificial intelligence that you envision happening over the next 10, 15 years will make it easier to prevent the abuse of power in general through computer systems, or more difficult to prevent the abuse of power?
Well, that was my initial complaint in a way, that the issues of preventing the abuse of power is a difficult job. I liked what Professor Rabin said about it, that it is complicated and that we build legal systems and so forth. Let me give as an example, I bet a lot of you have read Weizenbaum's book on computer reason and computer power and human reason, and you'll notice that there are a lot of arguments there about the dangers of having computers. If you take that book and replace the word computer by person, nothing changes. You see? So what I'm saying is, you could ask me my opinion about how to prevent totalitarianism and how to protect people's rights, but if you put it that way, you would never think of asking me, because I'm not a wise man who has said important and valuable things about freedom. And yet, just because it's a computer, I think the things are orthogonal. Maybe as technology increases, some things you get more power in some ways. You can ring everyone's telephone in the world all at once, which you might not have been able to do before. But I think the issues of how you protect people are not the kind of issues that you should ask someone like me, even though for years and years and years everyone has told you every day a scientist should think about the consequences of his invention. But that, we've all accepted that. That's like saying everyone should go and vote whether he has the foggiest idea or not. And we have that, don't we? There are people who announce on the radio, go out and vote. It doesn't matter whether you know who to vote. It's good for you to vote. It expresses something.
May I just say, Professor Minsky, there's an old Russian story which says, who is Stalin? They say Stalin is Genghis Khan with a telephone at one end.
That's beautiful.
That is, in one sense, technology is an extension of power.
Right. That says it better.
Do we have more questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Professor Minsky, looking long into the future, if you could for a moment, do you see artificial intelligence as going beyond the minds of its creators?
Yes, and that's why I didn't want to argue with Rabin about whether there could be artificial intelligence. All I wanted to say is that's one of the 3 or 4 most likely futures we're to have, and I think we ought to spend a little time worrying about that instead of saying that's Buck Rogers stuff, it can't happen. I certainly don't want to argue about when it will happen or if.
Doug Ross.
I think, just 1 second about that. There is an argument that nobody can make something smarter than himself. And lots of people think that somehow artificial intelligence is impossible because you'd have to know too much, or that there's a conservation of intelligence or something or other. But I think it's just a mental rhyme. You feel that there's sense to this recursive argument, but it isn't there. We know in the theory of recursive functions that a simple machine can make more complicated machines. In fact, it can make all possible machines, and it can even filter them to meet various tests. So what we've discovered in computer science is that if you can merely detect intelligence, then in some sense you can manufacture it. Of course, it's impractical, but I'm just saying that the apparent paradox that nobody can make something stronger than himself is not a paradox.
Doug Ross.
Marvin, that may be the answer to the question I was going to ask. Just as in mathematics, supposedly a proof is a proof. If, in fact, artificial intelligence is achieved, what will be artificial about it is going to be my question.
Yes, I think Doug is getting at something. People are afraid of being taken over by the machine, and I can understand that. We could also think of ourselves as not the, we value humans, we value ourselves. When I see a species valuing itself, of course, I'm a little suspicious, but put that aside, saying that it has the best things. But we have troubles. We die too soon, although my friend Newell said, no, it's just about the right time. But that's arguable. When we get immortality from our geneticists, we'll have a nice debate about how long people should be allowed to live. Sometimes it seems a shame that when someone dies, his memories are gone, and if we moved ourselves into computers, as happens in many science fiction stories, Arthur Clarke's The City and the Stars, then you might get to edit the memories you don't like and sort of freshen up every million years.
I think we have room for only about 1 or 2 more questions.
I think
Professor
Doug was
Sussman
talking
was
about
next.
that fine line there.
Excuse me. Professor Sussman.
Just looking at the title of this symposium, Future Partnership or Conflict for Computers and People, I have a little story of my own which I think is somewhat more important than that, which is, what are we going to get out of all this? What is going to happen 1,000 years from now that's going to matter? And as far as I see, computers don't matter at all. There's going to be lots of them. They're going to be walking around on the floors and crawling up the walls, and there's going to be one in every microphone, and you're going to carry one around in your keychain, and things like that. The real question is, what have we learned from it? Well, already we're beginning to see some of that. We can explain to each other things that couldn't be explained 50 years ago. One person can tell another a complicated procedure, how to go about doing something. 50 years ago, there was no language in which to say those things in a precise way. It would be very difficult to tell somebody, for example, the Risch algorithm for integrating mathematical expressions 50 years ago. Even if it could be written down, it would be books, tremendously fat, which were very imprecise. Now you can write it down so precisely that so stupid a computer as a PDP-10 can execute it. That's a tremendous difference. That's already finding its way into our culture. People are talking procedurally. Little kids come up to you and tell you how things are going to happen and why they can make it happen that way. That means that people can begin to take charge of their lives a little bit more because they can say how to do things. That's all I wanted to say.
Considering that this was an assertion, it doesn't need an answer.